Okay, Masechet Eruvin, page 67. Our outline is really three main topics. First, we're going to have two questions about bitul. Can we relinquish our right to the property, to our courtyard, when we did not have a chance to make an eruv? I'll explain more later. And then two things about a private entrance that's beside the alleyway, and then a discussion about karpef and different sizes. The three don't have much to do with each other. It's more by association. These two are questions that someone asks. So this is also a question formula. In this discussion, we mentioned the karpef, which is a enclosed storage area. So then we go into another longer discussion about karpef. So that's the common thread from each. All right, we'll start with the two questions, and we start with a fun agada. These two sages, Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshat, ki pageh behadeh hadadeh, Rav Chisda mirta'an sifvate mimatnayata de Rav Sheshat. Rav Sheshat mirta kule gufe pilpule de Rav Chisda. These two colleagues would shake when they met each other. Rav Chisda, his lips would tremble because Rav Sheshat was an expert in memorization of Tannaitic teachings. And so he was always afraid maybe he's going to come and ask him about some Tannaitic source that he didn't know of. So he was always fearful. Rav Sheshat was even more fearful. His whole body would shake when he met Rav Chisda, because Rav Chisda had a very sharp mind and would ask very insightful questions, difficult questions. And so Rav Sheshat was always afraid if he wouldn't have the answer. Okay, so that's a fun story between them, and we get a chance to see a couple of examples. So this is a question that Rav Chisda made Rav Sheshat. So Rav Chisda, the sharp one, is asking this to Rav Sheshat, the one who had memorized a lot. Shnei batim mishnei sidei reshut harabim, ubao goyim b'kifum mechitza b'Shabbat mahu. So the case is that there are two homes. I own one, you own one, on opposite sides of a public domain. So therefore, we cannot carry from one to another. We cannot make an eruv because there's a big street right in the middle. However, on Shabbat, non-Jews came and they built a wall on their own. We never asked them to. So now, all of a sudden on Shabbat, there's a wall there. This is one way to picture it. Here's another diagram, right? Two sides, and then maybe they just build fences in between, or like our fence, all the way around. And now, all of a sudden on Shabbat, we say, oh, look, we wake up in the morning, someone built a fence, how good. But we still can't use it until we make an eruv, or we can't make an eruv on Shabbat, or bitul reshut. I'll say, you know what, I relinquish my rights to this courtyard, and you can use the whole thing. And that would allow you to carry from your house to the courtyard. And I also could carry within the courtyard the things that are already there. So are we allowed to do this? That is the question. Okay. So okay, let's see the different sides of the question. Aliba demanda amar en bitul reshut mechaser lechaser lati ba'elach. Hashta di'i ba'u la'aruvem etmol masu me'arve amart en bitul reshut mechaser lechaser hacha di'i ba'u la'aruvem etmol lo masu me'arve lo kol sheken. Okay, if you remember yesterday, there was a machloket about can you relinquish rights, bitul, from one courtyard to another, right? Not we're all sharing the same courtyard, but one to another. Shemuel said you cannot. If let's say they're side by side, that case you cannot. Rabbi Yochanan said you can. Part of Shemuel's thinking is that you can en bitul reshut because he said that if you wanted, even if you wanted to, in the case where he said you can't side by side, even if you could have made an eruv before, and you prohibited each other from before, still you cannot make a bitul. So if you could have, in the case where you could have made an eruv before, that makes it easier to do bitul on Shabbat. So since in that case you could have, and still he says it's prohibited to do bitul on Shabbat, in this case where you could not have done an eruv before because there was no fence there before, Right? If there was no fence there before, no way of making an eruv if it was not enclosed. So then all the more so in this case where there's no fence that it would not be allowed. So in other words, he's saying, according to Shemuel, we don't even have to ask this question because Shemuel prohibited doing bitul when anytime you could have made it, even if you prohibited doing bitul, even if you could have made an eruv before, all the more so here when you could not have made an eruv before. Or in other words, not having the offense around there from before Shabbat makes this case worse than the other one. Okay, so we're not going to ask the question according to Yochanan, but rather according to Shemuel, but rather according to Yochanan. Yochanan, who did allow doing bitul in all the cases, whether it's inside and outside, side by side, no matter what. And this is kind of a common area that we're both sharing. But doesn't really belong to either one of us because it didn't belong to us before Shabbat. So So do we say in that case from those cases yesterday where there was a fence around it, so we could have made an eruv before? That's why the Yochanan says, okay, you can do bitul now. But in this case, Rabbi Yochanan would say, you couldn't have made an eruv before Shabbat because there were no walls. So therefore, no, I'm not going to let you do it on Shabbat. Right? So would he be by Mahmir and agree with Shemuel in this case? Or does it not matter? Would Rabbi Yochanan be lenient both in the case where there were walls before and we could have made an eruv, and he would also be lenient in this case, even though there were no fences there before Shabbat, and the non-Jews came and built a fence, would he still say it's permitted and you can do it? His answer was, Amar le en mevatilin. No, you can't. Even according to the Yochanan, who's usually lenient, would not allow you to do that in this case. He only allows you to do bitul when you could have made an eruv. You just forgot, you didn't get a chance to make an eruv, then he allows you to do bitul. But when you had no fences at all, then he says no. Okay, fine. So that answers that question. But now Rav Chisda asks another kind of similar case. Met goy b'Shabbat mahu. Okay, so this is an unfortunate case, but so we have Jews living in a courtyard with one non-Jew there. Now they did not make an eruv or bitul or rent from the non-Jew before Shabbat, so they cannot carry. But all of a sudden on Shabbat, too bad for the non-Jew, he dies. Now that the non-Jew is dead, he's not there anymore. So now the Jews that would have prevented them from carrying, because the non-Jew they can't rent from him. They didn't rent from him, but now that he's not around anymore, now it's only Jews. Can they relinquish their rights to the courtyard all to one person? And that way they can carry, right? Or do you say that the non-Jew was there when Shabbat started, so that's a problem? So that's the similarity between these cases. So again, here we're going to limit our question. So according to the one who says that you are allowed to rent from a non-Jew on Shabbat, right? We saw that you asked that question, right? Wait, how can you rent on Shabbat? You're doing a transaction. So we said it's not quite a total transaction. You're not transferring and signing documents or anything. According to the opinion that says you can rent from the non-Jew on Shabbat, and then you would do that, and then you would relinquish, all the Jews would relinquish property on Shabbat. So then, in that case, you're doing two things, renting and relinquishing. And that was allowed. Then for sure in this case where the non-Jew died, and so you don't have to rent from him, all you have to do is relinquish, for sure that would be okay. So you know what, we're not even asking about that question. Rather, Rav Chisda must have only been asking about the case of the other opinion, the more stringent opinion. According to the one who says you cannot rent from the non-Jew on Shabbat, the problem is there, perhaps, is that you can't do two things, rent and also relinquish property after you rented for the Jews. So you can't do two things, but maybe if it's only one thing, now that he died, we only have to relinquish, he would say it's okay. Or would he say, no, it doesn't matter, you can't relinquish on Shabbat. Once the non-Jew was there and he prohibited from you, you can't do it at all, even though he died. So Rav Sheshet says, I think we can be lenient in this case and permitted. He agrees with this first logic that the only reason that you can't rent is because you can't do two things, rent and relinquish, but if he died and you only have to relinquish property, that's okay. But B'hamnuna Amad en Mevatilin. But Rav Hamnuna said, no, it's not okay. You can't do that. All right, so those were the two questions that Rav Chisda and Rav Chisda asked Rav Sheshet, and he was able to answer them. Okay, so he didn't have to tremble too much. He had answers. All right, so now we get to another case of a non-Jew. Yes.
What if the Gentile who died had heirs there?
That's exactly right. Very good question. If there were other people living there, other non-Jews there living with him, then that would still be a problem. So this has to be that he had heirs, but they weren't around. And it's the same, similar to a case to a non-Jew who's not living, who's not, he went away, and he's not going to arrive on Shabbat. So then you don't have to worry about it.
Okay.
Right. That's, good. But actually the commentaries talk about exactly your question. So, good. Marav Yuda Amar Shemuel, Goy שיש לו פתח על ארבעה, פתוח לבקעה, אפילו מכניס ומוציא גמלים וקרונות כל היום כולו דרך מבוי, אין אוסר על בני מבוי. All right, we have a picture here, but we have a better picture here. So it's like this. You have a courtyard where Jews and a non-Jew lives. So the non-Jew, he has a separate private exit entrance on the side, as long as it's just 4x4, even if it's a small, window, but a person could fit through, and it opens up to a big area, a big valley. So that's one entrance, and you also have a common exit entrance here to an alleyway, to a mavoi. Okay, that's the scenario. Now, if you didn't have this opening, the small one, and the goy is now using the big one, then that's a problem for everyone else that lives around this alleyway, because they can all, share it and make a shituf, make a partnership, but the goy is going to be coming in and out and using it, and he's not part of that partnership. So it's a problem unless you go and rent it from him and all that. But let's assume they didn't rent it from him. However, now that we have this opening, we can say as follows. The non-Jew's main exit is this one. He's going to use that one because it's private, and it opens to a big area so that he can go and do whatever he wants, any work he wants to do out there. And so even if he may use the alleyway, since it's not, he has his main entrance, the alleyway is just a secondary entrance for him. Therefore, it's permitted for all the other Jews to join together, and then they can use the alleyway, and they don't have to worry about the non-Jew coming in and out. Okay, that's the basic thing. And now he adds yet another thing. Even if the non-Jew is taking camels in and out of his house all day long, obviously from the big entrance, still it's okay, because he has the small entrance that theoretically, potentially he could use, and he would prefer to use because it's private and it goes to a big area. So even if in practice he's bringing big camels out of the alleyway, we don't mind, and it does not undo the sharing of all the Jews from this alleyway. Okay, good. That's the opinion of Shemuel. My Tama, what's the reason? The entrance that is exclusive for him is preferable to him, even though it's small and he can't fit his camels there. But still, that's his entrance. Right? A person would rather, it's like my kids would rather a small room that they don't have to share than a much bigger room that they have to share with their siblings. Right? Okay, so now we have a question. What if it's not open, that private entrance, to a big valley, but rather only to a smaller enclosure, a karpef? Karpef means a closed space that's not used for living, but more of like for storage. So would that also be mahu? So the answer from Nachman, we heard a tradition, he heard from the teachers. We don't have exactly who the teachers were. He says, afilu patuch lekarpef. Yes, even if it's not to a big valley, but to a karpef, it's still, the non-Jew would prefer, that would be his preferable main entrance. And so the rest of the Jews can use the alleyway. All right, good. Now that we mentioned that, Rabba v'Rav Yosef Amret Harvaihu, they give a condition on this halacha. Goy bet sa'atayim oser. Yotemi bet sa'atayim eno oser. When we said that the non-Jew will use his private exit to the enclosure, even if it's a limited space. That's only true if it's more than 2,000 betzeah, another 5,000 square amot. Then that's a big area, and he would prefer to use that. But if it's smaller than 2 betzeah, then he's not going to want to use it. It's too small, and then he's going to prefer to use the alleyway as his main entrance, and therefore the other members of the alleyway will not be able to use it to carry there on Shabbat. Okay, so that makes a difference between bigger and smaller. And now here we have a paradox. B'Yisrael, but for a Jew, it's the opposite. Bet Satayim eno osed, yotemi bet Satayim osed. Let's say there's a Jew in this courtyard who didn't join in the alleyway with everybody else, and he has an enclosure behind. If that enclosure is less than 2 se'ah, then he will prefer to use it. If it's less than 2 se'ah, he's allowed to carry there. If it's more than 2 se'ah, he's not allowed to carry there. Okay. Remember, if you have something if we have a place where you live, then it can be very big. If it's walled and you live there, it can be very big. But we're talking about a storage area where nobody lives. So this is halakha we saw much earlier, that if it's a storage area that's enclosed but is not made for living, then only if it's less than 2 se'ah, then you can carry there. If it's bigger than 2 se'ah, you cannot carry there. So when it's a Jew, if it's bigger than 2 se'ah, he's not allowed to carry there. So he's not going to want to go there. He can't do anything. He can't bring out his picnic table. So it's no good. So therefore, he's going to use the alleyway and prohibit everyone else if he didn't join in. But if it's smaller, then he can use it. Okay. So I can't hear you. No, unmute.
That's only if the Jew protests or refuses to join the Eruv.
Either, he refused, or he just wasn't around, or he forgot, whatever it is.
Wasn't around. It could be, okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, exactly. Okay, good. So now we got that case. So we talked about the first 2 questions here, and we saw about a non-Jew's private entrance and the Jew's private entrance, which is the opposite. Okay, so now we get to the next question. Okay, this is still related to this point. He just asked him the question, what if it's open to not to an alley, not to a valley, but rather to a courtyard? And he gave the answer. We just said, if it's a non-Jew, then 2 se'ah, too small for him. More than that is good for him. Okay, so that concludes that topic. And now we get to the next one, the final topic. Amar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan Karpef Yotemi Bet Satayim Shelo Hukaf Ledira Va'afilu Kor Va'afilu Korayim Hazorek Letocho Hayav. Okay, so this enclosed area, a karpef, that's not used for residential use, so a storage area. If it's bigger than 2 se'ah, so remember, bigger than 2 se'ah means you're not allowed to carry there. Even if it's a cord, even if it's 2 cord, if you throw from Reshut HaRabim into it, then you are liable. Now, what does that mean? If you throw from Reshut HaRabim into it, you're liable. That means it itself is considered a Reshut HaYachid, right? Because if it was considered open area and a karmelit, in other words, that's the Rabbanan, or Reshut HaRabim, then it would be no problem to throw in it. So if he's saying that if you throw from Reshut HaRabim into this area, chayav, that means this area is called a Reshut HaYachid. So let's imagine this is very big, this enclosure, and it's only used for storage. If you throw into it, it's chayav. Why? Because it has an enclosure. It's fenced in. The only problem with it is that nobody's living there. So because nobody's living there, mid Rabbanan, the rabbi said, don't carry there. We're going to consider it kind of like has an aspect of Reshut HaRabim. We're going to be machmir and say don't carry there because it's kind of like Reshut HaRabim in the sense that no one lives there. But technically, midoraita, it is actually a Reshut HaYachid, and therefore, if you throw something from outside in, that would be chayav. That is a Biochanan statement. Okay. Now, we have a question on that statement from a Baraita. Metiv Rav Huna bar Chinina. Sela shebayam. גבוה 10 ורוחב 4, אין מטלטלין לא מתוכו לים ולא מן הים לתוכו. The case that we're asking from in the Braita is not a karpef, it's not an enclosed storage area, but rather a rock in the middle of a sea. Now, this rock, if it is 10 tefachim high by 4 tefachim wide, right, that's the minimum to be its own area, a reshut hayachid. So if you have that rock in the middle of the sea is a karmelit, which is a reshut harabim de rabanan, you cannot carry something from the water onto that rock or from the rock onto the water, because the rock is reshut hayachid and everything else around it is karmelit. Okay, pachot mikan metaltelin. If it's less than 10 by 4, or just a small little pole or something, then you can, because that's not considered anything. That's makom patur, and so then you can carry from one to the other. There's a different problem of carrying 4 amot in a karmelit. Let's say it's less than that. Okay, ad kama, and now the third line is the confusing one we're going to discuss a lot. Until how much? Ad bet se'atayim, until 2 bet se'ah. In other words, more than bet se'ah, that law is different. Okay, which law is different? Is it going on the second one or on the first one? That's what we're going to discuss now. But just to go back to the outline, so we had the Rabbi Yochanan, who said that a big karpef, because you can't transfer from outside into it, that means it's called the reshut hayachid. This is an enclosed area, and it's called the reshut hayachid, even though it's not used for living, and even though you can't carry inside it. Now we have the Braita that contradicts a similar case of, well, it's not an enclosed area, but an area that's raised 10 tefachim is also like it's enclosed. And yet here, we'll see what the question is. We didn't ask the question yet. In this case, 4 by 10 is its own reshut hayachid, you can't transfer. If it's smaller, then it's okay. If not, if it's bigger than 5,000, then that is not the law. Okay, what's not the law? Is C going on B? We try that out, doesn't work. And then we say, no, C must be modifying A, and we have 3 different solutions there. The 3 interpretations based on that. The first one is a challenge to Rabbi Yochanan, and the next 2 are responses to save Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so altogether we have 4 interpretations of this. The first one thinks that C is modifying B, but that doesn't make any sense. All the rest say C is modifying A. One of them doesn't work for the Rabbi Yochanan, but the other 2 do work for the Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, that's the big picture of what we're about to see. Now, ahaya, this last line, what is it modifying? Ilema asefa, if it's modifying the last part, bet satayim tefe la, vaha mekarmelit karmelit ka metaltel. If it's going on the last line that says, if it's a small thing, in other words, if it's like shallow, less than 10, then you're allowed to carry on it. How much? Until 2 se'ah. So if it's bigger than 2 se'ah but shallow, what? Then it's a problem? It would still not be a problem. Anything shallow, less than 10 tefachim high, is just like considered the ground. So it's just like being the sea. So it doesn't matter how big it is. That's just moving from karmelit to karmelit. That wouldn't be transferring from one domain to the other. Okay, so we reject that. Ela aresha, rather, the third part has to be modifying the first. That when are you not allowed to carry from the sea to the rock when it's 10 by 4 or bigger or bigger or bigger? How big? Until 2,000 amot. So it's saying like this, Hachi kamad, Sela shebeyam gavo 10 v'rochav 4, en metaltelin lo mitocho layam velo min hayam letocho. ועד כמה עד בית סעתיים. היתר מבית סעתיים מטלטלין. So you can't transfer from the sea to the rock if it's 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide. As big as 2 bet se'ah, you're still not allowed. But more than 2 bet se'ah, you are allowed to transfer. Oh, there you go. So if something is very big, more than 2 bet se'ah, and it's not used for living, then you can transfer from outside to inside. Alma karmeliti tiuftad Rabbi Yochanan. And here is the question to Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said that if I have a large storage area, it's considered a reshut hayachid, and I cannot transfer from outside to in. And yet, based on this derivation, we just proved that a large rock, right, that is more than 5,000 amot, square amot, is considered a karmelit, and I can transfer from outside to in. That is the question. That's the challenge. So now we're going to have two answers. Amarava, man de la yada teruse matnayata. A very sharp answer. Someone who doesn't know how to explain a simple barait mishnah, doesn't know how to explain a mishnah, is going to ask a question on Rabbi Yochanan. You completely misinterpreted this mishnah, right? So before get your own house in order before you go ask questions about the great Rabbi Yochanan. Le'olam aresha. I agree with you that it has to be on the resha. But you misinterpreted what the derivation, what we're inferring from that. Hachi kamad ha betocho metaltelin. The point vad kama ad bet sa'atayim. The point of the derivation is that rock, if it's 4x10 or bigger, you cannot transfer from outside to inside. No matter how big, you can't transfer from outside to inside. But you can carry on top of the rock itself. If it's less than 5,000 amot, then you can carry on the rock because it's a reshut hayachid. Reshut hayachid you can carry on. And then C says, and how till when? Until 5,000 amot. More than 5,000 amot, then you cannot carry anymore. And so this is consistent with Rabbi Yochanan. Just like Rabbi Yochanan says that a large karpef, a large storage area, more than 5,000, you cannot transfer from outside to in because it's a shut hayachid. So too, this also, a big rock up to 5,000 amot, the shut hayachid, and you can carry there more, but no matter what, smaller or bigger than 5,000 amot, it's still called a reshut hayachid, and you cannot transfer from outside to in. And so all that is consistent. Okay, very good. And so now we're going to have one last explanation that is also consistent. Rav Asher amar le'olam aresha. I agree with you, it's on the resha. Hen amru vehen amru. But in fact, I can go back to the 2 is actually the same as 4. 2 derived that you can transfer if it's over 5,000. And he says, I agree with that. And it's still okay for the Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because as follows, there's a difference between the case of a karpef, which is in an enclosed area on land, and a rock in the middle of the sea. There's a reason to make a distinction between these two things. And so I can actually agree with your interpretation for number 2, but rather than be a challenge to Rabbi Yochanan can answer it because the rock is different. What we're going to say basically is a large karpef is actually a karmelit, not a reshut hayachid. And it takes stringencies of both. When it's on land, we're stringent to not transfer in and not to carry. But a large rock, the rabbis permitted transferring because it's unusual that people transfer in the middle of a sea to a rock, and they wanted to emphasize the prohibition of carrying. So they said, by saying you can't transfer from outside to in, then people would really think of it as a reshut hayachid. By saying you can transfer from outside to in, people would really think of it as a reshut harabim, and then make sure not to carry. And so that is something that they could do for the rock, but they couldn't do for the karpef. That's basically what we're going to say. We'll see it inside. Hen amru karpef yater mibet sa'atayim shelo kaf ledira en metaltelin bo ela ba'arba amot vehen amru en metaltelin meshut hayachid lekarmelit. So they said regarding the rock that if it's more than 2 se'ah, karpef, regarding the karpef, if it's more than 2 se'ah and it's not used for residence, that you cannot transfer within it. You can't carry inside of it. And they also, which means it's being treated like a reshut harabim, and yet they also said you cannot transfer from reshut hayachid to karmelit, which means that they're treating it not like a reshut harabim, and yet they say both. How can they work together? Bet sa'atayim desharel tartule bechole asir banan tartule lo min hayam letocho velo min tocho layam. Mai ta'ama reshut hayachid gemura hi. When it comes to a rock, if bet sa'atayim, that's up to 2 se'ah, therefore you are allowed to carry on that rock and anywhere on it, but you cannot transfer from the rock to the water or from the water to the rock. Why? Because it's a Reshut HaYachid Gemurahi. Reshut HaYachid, you can carry on it, but not from there outside, from outside onto it. If it's Yatemi Betzat time, if the rock is bigger than 2 se'ah, in that case, you're not allowed to carry on it. So there's a balance. Since you're allowed to carry on it, since you're not allowed to carry on it, that permits you to transfer from outside to inside. Because if they would say that you can't transfer from outside to in, then you'd say, oh, you can't transfer because there's Shut HaYachid, and then they're going to think that you're allowed to carry on it itself. So therefore, in order to give that message, to really emphasize not carrying on the rock, they said that you are allowed to transfer from outside to in. And how is the rock different that they gave that permission, and they did not give that permission regarding the karpef, even though it's quite similar? So because tocho shechiach mitocho layam menayam letocho la shechiach. Because carrying on the rock is commonplace. Transferring from outside to inside is not commonplace. And therefore, it's better to emphasize the fact that you cannot carry on the rock, and rather than have a need to emphasize the carrying from outside to in. All right, and that concludes that discussion. And so we resolved the question on Rabbi Yochanan in 2 different ways with 2 different interpretations. And now we'll end off with one last story. Hahu yanoka de ishtepich chamimeh. There was a baby who had needed a brit milah on Shabbat. The 8th day was on Shabbat, and one of the halachot of health and safety is that you should bathe the infant in warm water before and after the brit milah. However, they had prepared in this case warm water, but it spilt, and now they don't have warm water to prepare the baby for the brit milah. And they would not do the brit milah without doing that, because that would be dangerous to the baby. So now they need to get warm water because they still want to do the brit milah on Shabbat. So Rabban says, I have some warm water in my house, so why don't you go and bring it from my house. And this is, no, we can't do it. There's no eruv here, so we can't carry the water from your house to this house. Or even though you didn't make an eruv in this courtyard, surely you made a shituf mevo'ot, a partnership of all the different courtyards to one alleyway. And in a pinch, if you didn't make an eruv for each courtyard, but you did share all the courtyards with the alleyway, so it's still all shared, so we can rely on that. And you can go and carry from my house to and bring some water here. And says, no, we did not even make a shituf mevo'ot. We didn't do anything. We didn't do an eruv. We didn't do a shituf, so we cannot carry. So finally, the Rabba's answer is go tell a non-Jew to bring the water from my house. Now, it's generally a problem to ask a non-Jew to do any melacha. Anything that you can't do, you can't ask a non-Jew to do either. However, in extenuating circumstances, it's permitted. So Rabbah felt like it would be permitted. Now, with the rabbis, in the meantime, had some discussion about this. When Rabbah said that, Abaye was sitting there, says, I wanted to ask Rabbah a question about this. Is this really permissible to ask a non-Jew to do something to violate Shabbat for you? But Rav Yosef was next to me, and he wouldn't let me ask a question. Why? Because Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Kahana, Ki havenan be Rav Yehuda, hava amar lan bedoraita, motvinan tiyuvta v'hadar avdinan maaseh. B'derabanan avdinan maaseh, v'hadar motvinan tiyuvta. Rav Yosef had a rule that regarding a law that's from the Torah, then we have to ask a question, make sure we're doing it correctly and not violating any Torah law, and then we'll go, only then can we act. But regarding a derabanan, we can be more lenient. Derabanan, if we're not sure, then we can just do the action, assume it's allowed, and then we'll clarify and make sure later. Even though we're not 100% sure, and we may be violating, but there's no way to figure it out right now. It's pressing need. We have to ask, we have to do it first then you can rely on the possibility that's okay because they said Rabbanan, so we can be mekel. And so in this case, since asking a non-Jew to do something for you on Shabbat is a shivut, it's considered like a derabanan, and then therefore, when Rabban said to do it, we're not going to ask questions, right? We're going to follow. We're going to ask the non-Jew to bring the water for the baby on Shabbat, and then we'll discuss and clarify later, where after it's all done, and we'll know better for next time. But no need to ask now. Okay. So afterwards, they brought the water. They did the brit milah. Everybody's happy, and so now he said, Rav Yosef says, "My ba'et lemor." Okay, now you can ask. What exactly was the content of the question that you wanted to ask the master? Rabba, Amar le Detanya za'a shivut, v'amira legoy shivut. Ma za'a shivut v'nadochat haShabbat, af amira legoy shivut v'nadochat haShabbat. I have a braita that brings two cases. Haza'ah, if someone is tameh and they need to become tahor, tameh lamet, so you bring the paraduma water and you sprinkle it on the person. You cannot do that on Shabbat. That is a sumid rabbanan because of shivut. It's not a restful thing to do, to go and gather people and do the sprinkling, even though it might be actually quite necessary if you have to do Korban Pesach that night. So you need to do it already on Shabbat if you didn't get a chance to do it before, or you weren't tahor, your days weren't up before. So even though you need to do it on Shabbat for the sake of a mitzvah, still you're not allowed to do it on Shabbat, even though it's only to the banan. So too, Amira Legoy is in the same category. That's also a shivut, and we should not be able to do it on Shabbat. We should not ask a non-Jew to bring the water, even though it's for a mitzvah. And we won't be able to do the mitzvah if we don't do it, if we don't ask the non-Jew. So, right, it should be parallel, and therefore we should not have asked the non-Jew. That was the question. Seems like a good question. Amale velashani lan ben shivut eit b'maaseh l'shvut elet b'maaseh. Rabbi Yosef says, well, don't you think there's a difference between a shivut where you're doing an action and where you're not doing an action? So what does he mean? What's the difference here? Because the Rabban, the master, did not tell the non-Jew specifically go and heat up water, but rather he said go bring water. And so it was not as direct. The distinction is not so easy to understand. There are some versions that don't have that explanation of zil achem. In that case, the distinction, if you don't have those words, would be as follows. Regarding the haza'ah, sprinkling the water, the Jew is actively doing the sprinkling, which is a sumad rabbanan. But regarding asking the Jew himself is not doing any action. It's just he's asking the non-Jew, and non-Jew is therefore doing it. But the Jew himself it's a passive prohibition, right, of just allowing the non-Jew to do something for you, or even speaking, but you're not doing it yourself. So passively, a passive transgression is better than an active transgression. And that's why, in the case of allowing the non-Jew to go get water, that would be permitted on Shabbat in the case of a need, in order to be able to do this mitzvah. Baruch Adonai Olam. Amen ve'amen.